We began this Mass by singing a hymn for all the saints, and we begin the month of November with the Feast of All the Saints. And even today, as we remember Veterans Day, the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I, this particular year, we also celebrate and remember the feast day of St. Martin of Tours, who is a saint who, believe it or not, was a veteran. He was a soldier who retired from the military and became a monk and one of the great early saints of the Church. But also, the second day of the month of November, we remember the commemoration of All Souls, all those who have gone before us. And the entire month of November, we remember those who have gone before us. And perhaps in a special way, remembering today's readings, those who have died who were in this life were called to be husbands and wives, and who leave behind loved ones, widows and widowers. And we have two such saintly widows in our readings today who showed a great deal of generosity as examples to be held up even in the sacred scriptures. And yet their examples of generosity are particular, because when you look at them, especially the widow in today's gospel, a very famous, well-known story, we like to refer to it as the widow's mite. The widow exercises generosity, but she was not giving to the poor. She herself was poor. The widow and her son in today's first reading were not exercising generosity to the poor, because they themselves were poor. Rather, in the book of Kings, the widow and her son exercised generosity to one of God's prophets, the last of an institution of prophets in the kingdom of Israel. They were experiencing a tremendous persecution under their own king, King Ahab, whose pagan wife Jezebel had the faithful prophets all murdered in favor of her prophets of the god Baal, and Elijah was the last of them. And in exercising generosity, the widow of the first reading sustains this last prophet of God with the last of what she had, the last of the oil, the last of the flour, and God sustained her in the midst of the great drought. In the gospel, we have the widow putting forth her coins into the temple treasury, contributing to another institution of the kingdom of Israel, the temple worship. In so doing, she wasn't so much giving to the poor as she was giving and contributing to the worship life of her people, the worship life of the temple. And so it's a particular kind of giving that we see in the readings today, and I suppose is a rather awkward theme because, let's face it, folks, this is a collection homily about giving not so much to the poor, but to the religious institutions and the life of worship that we have here in the church, and in particular, St. Vincent's Parish. But folks, don't worry, this is not going to be up here shilling for more money. But it is a part of our life as a people of faith. And it's not just something that's we crassly come up with every now and again because we need a little more cash. This is actually part of what are called the 5 precepts of the Catholic Church. The rules, if you will, that they follow. You know how many people often, being critical of the Church, will often say, "Well, I don't like the Catholic Church. There are just too many rules that the Catholic Church has." Well, the rules that they refer to are actually the very high standards that we have. No holds barred of high standards we are called to live as followers of Christ, made in the image and likeness of God. But in terms of outright rules that we follow, there are in fact only 5. And we would know those traditionally as the precepts of the Catholic Church, and we can find those in the Catechism of the Catholic Church. The first of those precepts is Mass on Sunday and holy days. That is what we are all doing here, fulfilling that precept, hopefully because we have a deep desire to give a little bit of this time to God in worship of Him, but also in fulfillment of a precept of the Church. The second precept is we must go to confession at least once a year, preferably during the season of Lent. Now, I know many people, including myself, who go a number of times a year. But the precept at least says, in preparation for Easter, we go to confession once a year, no less than once a year. The third precept is we must receive communion during Easter. Note, I did not say go to Mass during Easter. That's one area in which Catholics often get it mixed up, which is why we see the large crowds on Easter Sunday, and we don't see the large crowds the other times of the year. But if we don't receive communion because of the state of our soul or for other reasons during the course of the year, we are required, however, during Easter, as part of our celebration of Easter, to receive communion. If we don't think we're worthy, then, of course, the second precept, we go to confession so that we can receive communion. The fourth precept is to participate in the days of fasting and abstinence, which we do predominantly during the season of Lent. That is when we have those days of fasting and abstinence. Fasting on Ash Wednesday and Good Friday, and days of abstinence of Ash Wednesday and the Fridays during Lent, in which we abstain from meat. And in recent months, many of the bishops in our church in this country, even here in San Francisco, have asked that we return to the practice that we used to have of abstaining every Friday, abstaining from meat every Friday. The fifth precept is what we see exercised by the widows in today's gospel, that we are to contribute to the well-being of the church as we can. And that, again, comes not from just a task of the church to raise money and constantly nickel and dime the people, but it participates in a tradition that goes far, far back before even the establishment of the church, as far back as the very origin, or if you will, the genesis of the people of Israel. As they were standing at the foot of Mount Sinai receiving God's law, He does give them a command, but it's not a command that's devoid of context. If you know the history of the people of Israel, you know that Israel is divided into 12 tribes. The 12 tribes are named for the 12 sons of Jacob. But if you look at the listing of the names of the 12 tribes, you'll know that one tribe is missing. One tribe is missing, and that is the tribe of Joseph, who presumably was the favorite son of Jacob. Remember the story of the coat of many colors and Joseph and his brothers. Joseph is not included as a tribe of Israel, but rather his two sons are, Ephraim and Manasseh, which would bring us to 13 tribes. So there's another tribe that is actually excluded in the listing of the 12 tribes of Israel. And that is because only of the 13 tribes, 12 of them received a portion of the land of the Promised Land. After Joshua conquered the Promised Land following the Exodus from Egypt, the different tribes drew lots and received a portion of that land to till, to cultivate, to earn the income and a living, and to live and thrive as the individual tribes united in one community of the people of Israel. But one tribe was excluded in that, and that was the tribe of Levi. Now, we might not see the name of Levi listed among the tribes of Israel, but we certainly know of the Levites in the Scriptures. All one has to do is look at the story of the Good Samaritan, the man who was beaten on the side of the road. The first person to go by is a priest, the second is a Levite. Well, the Levites were tasked as a tribe to live among all the 12 tribes of Israel, and their task was to maintain and lead and administer the worship life of the people of Israel. So they were not given any land to manage, to maintain, to till. Their task was the worship life of the people of Israel. But they needed some source of income. So there's where we find in the law, in the Scriptures, in the Old Testament, God's command that each tribe would give 10% of their produce to the Levite tribe. And there's where we get the tradition of tithing, the 10%. And which, if you can do the math in your head, you realize that with 12 tribes giving 10%, that was a pretty good deal. The Levites received 120%. But, as in all things, there was a catch. Because in the book of Numbers, God also commands the Levites that of what they receive from the other tribes, they too must give 10% dedicated strictly to the worship work that they do, not just for their own sustenance, but the worship work that they do. So we see in that, in the very Scriptures, the task and the practice of tithing and supporting not just the poor, the widow, the orphan, the immigrant, those in need among them, but also contributing to the worship life of the community of faith. And we certainly see that with the widow of the first reading, with the institution of the prophets, of which Elijah was the only one left, and in the woman in the gospel who gives from her want, she gives all that she had to the temple treasury. We see in both of these women not just the charism of maintaining the worship life, but also a tremendous trust in God that these women had. Elijah calls on the woman to trust in God, because he says God has promised that the jug of oil will not run dry and the jar of flour will not go empty. Trust in God that God will take care of you. We don't have any such promise in the gospel, but we can certainly presume that the woman who gives the widow's mite had a trust in God. She's giving her whole livelihood, but she has trust that God will, one way or the other, take care of her. And so, not only is it a sacrifice, but for us it is also a charism. As a Catholic Church, we don't require, obviously, people to give 10% of their income. But the spirituality behind it is that God is entitled to the first 10%, not the spare change that's in our pocket. And you see the difference, perhaps a difference in outlook in that. And as in all things, we are definitely grateful for the contributions of the people of the parish to help us maintain the parish, to keep the lights going, to pay the bills, and help to support the staff that we have here. And as in all things, there is a catch, because I at least want to let you know that I am at least one priest who's willing to put his money where his big mouth is. And ever since ordination, in every parish I have been at, one of the first things I ask when I start is for envelopes. And yes, folks, some of you may have seen, I do contribute in the collection each week in every parish that I have. I don't know about the other priests, but that's at least a commitment that I make to every parish that I am in, because I am at least unwilling to ask the people to do something that I am unwilling to do myself. And I've calculated roughly how much each week would constitute roughly 10% of my income. And I have to admit, in the beginning it was kind of difficult. We all have our expenses. But I have found that in making that commitment as your priest and as a part of this parish community, it does come back to me. God in many ways does bring it back in some ways. So I realize that, making that commitment, something we do automatically, and in the end God does take care of things. But in the end it is a charism that we have as a people of faith. And the charism of generosity is meant to move us to reflect upon recognizing God's generosity in our lives. How fortunate many of us are to live the lifestyle we have, to perhaps have the income that we have, the skills that God has given us, whereby we can earn a living to take care of ourselves, to take care of our families, and to recognize that. And the more we grow in understanding, recognizing, and appreciating the generosity of God, then the more we can be moved to exercise generosity to those in need. And just as we heard last week in the gospel, the basic command that God gives us, that we are to love God with all our heart, with all our soul, and with all our strength, and we are to love our neighbor as ourselves, we are called to exercise that generosity to those in need. In deference to that command, love your neighbor as yourself. But also to contribute as we can to the well-being of our institutions of worship, our church, our faith community, in deference to that first commandment, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. Some people have told me, well, they prefer to give to the poor rather than to a building, but at the same time, this building brings in people, and the people come and they worship God, and they come and they receive the Eucharist. They form this community of faith that is St. Vincent's Parish, and that we are called to contribute in both ways, to reflect upon how we can. The Church, again, doesn't make any demand. Some churches do, but the Catholic Church does not. But as a precept, as a spiritual disposition, and as a charism, we're called to be a generous people to those in need, but also to our institutions of worship. And in that, we see a tremendous example in the two widows of today's first reading, and hopefully an example that can be carried on by those around us, our children, as we come forward to fulfill that basic command in this charism of generosity, to love our neighbor as ourself, and to love the Lord our God with all our heart, with all our soul, and with all our strength.